This was back in 2014. I was a 20-year-old community college student living with my parents in Southern California. I had a tight-knit group of stoner friends. There were 5 of us, myself included. We're all still best friends today. Like all bored suburban kids, our days hanging out usually consisted of loitering in parking lots, getting stoned, and going to parties when we could. We had a few smoke spots around town we would go to and get high at. Our main spot was a place called the Sewer Lair. It was a giant storm tunnel at the end of a trail in this canyon area behind one of the local neighborhoods. It was secluded, and we could be as loud as we wanted since there were no houses nearby. The tunnel was maybe about 20 feet in diameter. A small stream of water ran down the center of it. There was this offshoot directly to the right just past the entrance that led to another smaller tunnel system. This is where we would hang out. We would come here almost every night. So one night, we were at the Sewer Lair. It was maybe around 1 a.m. We would usually hang out pretty late and wait for our parents to go to sleep, so we don't come home and have to see them smelling like weed and cigarettes. Me and the boys were smoking, talking, and listening to music, the usual. Except this night, water was draining from one of the tunnel systems further down. It was pretty loud. It sounded like a small waterfall. This had happened a few times before, so we didn't think anything of it. We don't get much rain in California, so it made sense that this would only happen once in a while. A few hours in, one of the guys kept looking over at the main tunnel. Says he thinks he's hearing voices. We tell him it's just the music and our voices echoing, but we turned off the music and listened silently to prove that he's just stoned and being paranoid. We listened closely and we could hear these faint voices. It was difficult to hear because of the waterfall, but it sounded like a group of people chanting. We froze and traded glances. We sat in silence and listened for a few minutes. One of the bros finally snapped and insisted we go check it out. A few of the bros were scared and didn't want to do it, but after some bickering, we decided to go see what was happening. There was 5 of us. What could go wrong? So we used the flashlights on our phones and make our way down the main tunnel. We walked for about 15 minutes and the chanting got louder, but it still sounded very far away. We still couldn't make out what they were saying because the waterfall was so loud, but it was definitely a group of people speaking in unison. We walked for a while longer. At this point, we made it so far that there wasn't even graffiti on the walls or trash on the ground anymore. As we continued walking, we noticed that the tunnel was getting warmer. It was always really cold here, so it was strange that the temperature was gradually rising the further we went. We kept moving. The chanting was getting loud, so we knew we were close. It was loud enough to realize that the chanting was in a different language and that it had to be at least 4 or 5 people. We kept moving and noticed the graffiti on the walls started to show up again. It was different than before though. It was all very eerie. I immediately brushed it off as just edgy kids trying to scare people. But the further we walked, the more unsettling the markings on the walls became. It was a lot of weird occult type shit. There were melted black candles scattered on the ground with these weird trinkets around them. The trinkets looked handmade and were made of animal bones, string, and cloth. We were all quietly inspecting the area when one of the guys points down the tunnel and tells us to cut out the lights. We turn off our flashlights and look. We could see a faint, flickering orange light far down the tunnel. It was barely visible because it was so far, but we could tell that the light was coming from either candles or torches by the way it was flickering. It wasn't a direct light either, so it had to be coming from one of the offshoots in the tunnel. Our phones were all low on battery, so we started speed walking toward the orange light. The chanting continued. Then out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream bellowed from the tunnel up ahead. We all froze and put our lights down. It was the most horrifying scream I've ever heard in my life. I couldn't even tell if it was human or an animal. The chanting continued, then another horrifying scream echoed down the tunnel. The guys were ready to get the fuck out, but I insisted that we check it out. I led the way as we slowly walked towards the light. The chanting and screaming continued. We made it about 30 feet from the offshoot that the light and voices were coming from. The tunnel was very hot at this point, and it smelled awful. The air was thick, and it was difficult to breathe. We were sweating, and it felt like we were suffocating. We inched our way towards the offshoot as the chanting continued. flinching every time there was another awful scream. The screams had become increasingly more violent and non-human sounding. We were all lined up, our backs against the wall of the main tunnel in front of the offshoot. The chanting and screams were coming from right around the corner. The boys gestured at me to take a peek. I took some deep breaths. My heart was pounding. I quickly peeked in for a second, then pulled back. This offshoot was exactly like the one at the entrance we would hang out at. At the center was a naked man on his knees, with his hands on the ground and his back to me. He was covered in dirt and sweat. He was in front of what looked like some kind of handcrafted altar. The walls were covered in writing. The whole area had crowds of black candles lining the walls, and they were all lit. There had to be at least 50 or 60 of them. The man was also sitting at the center of some kind of candle formation. My face went numb. I looked at the guys and couldn't even speak. The chanting and screams continued as I just gave them a blank stare. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. The chanting and screaming sounded like it had to be a total of at least 5 people, but there was only one guy in there. I decided to take another peek mid-chant. This time, my whole body went numb. All of the chanting and screaming was coming from this one man. It was like he had 5 voices at once. I gestured to one of the bros next to me to take a look. He stepped forward and his foot brushed against the ground, making a loud scraping sound that echoed. We all froze. Then the chanting completely stopped. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was dead silent. We all looked at each other. Then out of nowhere, we made a sprint for the entrance all at once. None of us even said a word. We just ran as fast as we could. It felt like we were running forever. We hauled ass for about 10 minutes before finally getting out of the storm tunnel. We stood in the field in front of the sewer layer and caught our breath. A couple of the guys were throwing up from the sprint. After we caught our breath, I told them everything I saw. They were all speechless, trying to comprehend what just happened. We started hearing screams from the tunnel. This time they were long and drawn out, almost like a howling wolf. We ran up the trail to the neighborhood and got the fuck out of there. We vowed to never come back again. This was 6 years ago, and it still haunts me and the bros today. I have no explanation for what happened. I don't know much about Satanism or cult-type shit, but if anyone does, feel free to give your thoughts on what you think was happening that night. Would really appreciate it. Thanks. This happened a few years ago in my old one-person flat. I had a strange feeling that something wasn't right for a few days. Like I was sure that the food in the fridge was less than I put back the last time. I found pillows from my couch on the floor, stuff like that. I lived alone back then, so there wasn't anyone else with access to my flat. Or so I thought. Well, one night I woke up around 1 in the morning, sweating, and even though I didn't remember, was sure I woke up from a nightmare. Since I was drenched in sweat, I decided to take a shower, so I put my phone up in the bathroom for music, turned on the water, and enjoyed my shower. A few minutes in, I heard the door move. I never close it, but it still never moves. I took a look at the shower curtain and saw a shadow against it, and a look at my phone confirmed someone was there. Since I could clearly see a reflection in my screen that showed someone standing next to the shower curtain. It took me a lot not to scream and to keep acting like I didn't notice anything, while silently taking the shower head off the holding and turning the water all the way to hot. I am still kind of impressed of that quick thinking. Our water got really hot when you cranked it all the way to hot, and a few seconds later, steam was raising and the water hurt my feet flowing to the drain. I turned around, ripped the shower curtain open, and held the shower head right at the person behind it. It was a woman. She screamed in pain. I whacked her in the face with the shower head and jumped out of the shower and ran to the door, taking the key out of the lock and locking it closed behind me. A little later, she started to bang on the door, but the door didn't give. I called the cops and went to the kitchen to get my big kitchen knife, just for safety. I felt like my throat was closing up when I saw it missing and realized there's only one place where it could possibly be right now. The police came and arrested the woman, who turned out to have been the former person living in the flat and was evicted after not paying rent. Seems she made a copy of the key and came into the flat when I was at work and sometimes at night. It's possible that what woke me up in the first place was her, and honestly, I don't even want to think about it. Ever since then, I always insist that the locks are changed when I move into a new place. Several years ago, I worked at a crisis unit for the acutely mentally ill. It was a 10-bed unit where individuals would come to stay as a step-down from a psychiatric hospitalization or a diversion to prevent psychiatric hospitalization. I often worked alone on the weekends. One Friday evening, we received an admission, Michael. Background info was provided with a referral indicating a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and recent release from prison after serving a sentence for murder. I completed the initial intake meeting with Michael, during which time he said some sexually explicit things to me. I made it clear that this was inappropriate and that confidentiality was limited and that the staff working on the unit as part of his treatment team would be privy to anything said in the interview or subsequent one-on-one sessions. He responded well to the redirection. We finished the intake, and I went about the rest of my shift until about 11 p.m. that night, when he approached the office and asked if I was working alone. Luckily, at the time, I wasn't alone, and I told him that my male coworker was in the adjoining office. After this encounter, I explained the situation to my coworker, who read my shift summary and decided to sit down with Michael and tell him the way he was acting was not acceptable, and he could risk being released from the program if it continued. The next morning, I was working alone from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Around 9 a.m., I went to wake up another client, Jeremy, to administer his medications. The room Jeremy was assigned was at the end of the hallway, and he was usually slow to get up in the mornings. While I was knocking on Jeremy's door, Michael approached me to tell me he didn't appreciate that I had shared the things he said to me with my male coworker. I explained to Michael that he knew what he said was inappropriate, and that he knew anything he said to me would be shared with the rest of the treatment team. Michael became more agitated and got in my face, backing me into the corner in front of Jeremy's bedroom. At this point, Jeremy had woken up and heard what was happening outside his room. Jeremy came out of his room, stood between Michael and myself, and told Michael that he needed to walk away and cool down. Michael went back to his room, and I contacted my supervisor, who told me to document the encounter and continue my shift. Needless to say, I left that job shortly after this incident. I am thankful for Jeremy and that he had the presence of mind, while also being a client with a mental illness, to intervene on my behalf. I often wonder what would have happened if Jeremy wouldn't have woken up, or if he would have been in a more severe state of mental illness and would have become agitated as well. Michael, let's never meet again. So, I work for a very major retailer you've all heard of. This was from 1.5 years or so, back when I worked in the electronics and photo departments. One afternoon, I answered the phone and spoke to a customer. He wasn't very direct about what exactly he was looking for. At first, he said he was looking for a gift, for a family member that he hated. He said he wanted it to be something they would accept because of the obligation, but would absolutely hate. I asked if he was looking for a type of a gag gift, and he dodged my question. Instead, he started asking me what I would buy if I wanted to get a gift for a family member like that. I said I wasn't sure, but maybe a movie or some music they didn't like would be a good choice. Then he surprised me by asking what type of movies I liked watching. I said it wasn't anything that would really fit what he was looking for, as I usually watch anime. Next he asked if that was something I'd want to watch over dinner. I said I certainly do watch it while I eat dinner sometimes, not knowing where he was going with this. Then he said, "No, I meant with me." I laughed nervously and told him no. Then I quickly changed the subject back to what he was looking for, and he asked if we had a certain TV series in stock. I told him I'd go check. By this point, I was feeling pretty uncomfortable, but I wanted to keep up my customer service and not disappoint the customer by being rude. So I found what he was looking for, and then told him the price and how many copies were in stock. After this, he asked me some other questions about myself, and I told him that perhaps I wasn't the best person to help him, so I handed the phone off to a male coworker. I walked away from the desk at that point and made my way back to the photo department, where I felt safer, as I wasn't in direct view of customers who were walking around. I took a moment to collect myself before I left. This next part was of my coworker's interaction with a customer on the phone. My coworker introduced himself in the usual manner and asked how he could help. The man said, "Aw man, where did that cute bubbly girl go?" My coworker replied with an improvised response of, "Oh, she's actually our photo associate. She doesn't know as much about electronics." To which the customer responded with, "Oh, I'd like to see some pictures of her naked." To which my coworker didn't know how to respond. The customer then said it would be easier to just shop in person and that he'd be back later to see me, and hung up. I asked my coworker if he was ever able to get the customer off the phone. He told me about what the customer said, and I felt sick. I was also so terrified of coming into contact with this customer that I went to management and reported the issue to them. They chuckled and said there wasn't anything they could do, as it was likely just a prank caller. I was worried about spending any time on the sales floor, but I still had to complete my shift. That evening, I was terrified. I politely asked a male coworker to walk me to my car. He obliged, and we saw no trace of the creepy guy anywhere, and I've never heard from him ever since then. So, to the creepy guy who called my work, let's never meet. To really understand the story, or maybe how it happened, you need to know a few things first. I live in Belgium, and at the time of the events, 2018, I lived at home with my parents, siblings, older brother and sister, and my sweet dog. Looking back now, maybe my dog is a bit too sweet. Also important to note is that my family is all over the place. Everybody is always busy doing something. Everyone has a very different rhythm, and some days we live next to each other instead of with each other. So that's why at the time I didn't really know who was home and who wasn't. So in 2018, on a school night, I woke up to some noises in my room. I was confused and looked at my phone. It was around 3 a.m. You know that feeling when you wake up very abruptly and don't know if you're dreaming or awake? That was kind of how I felt. There's a street light right at my window, so even though the curtains were closed, I could still make out some silhouettes and figures. As I had just woken up and wasn't really thinking, I thought the silhouette I saw in my room was my older brother. I was sleep drunk, as you could call it, and started asking him what he was doing. But he didn't really react. I saw him walking towards my jewelry, and I asked him again, what was he doing? Again, my brother didn't respond. I was still laying in bed, and I began to feel angry because I had school the next day and had to get up early. And as you do with irritating siblings, I started to curse him out. "Jope, get the F out, I have school tomorrow." Jope is the name of my brother, by the way. This time he looked at me, but again didn't say anything. He started to walk toward my handbag and started looking in it and taking things out. At this point, I was just angry at my brother and finally got out of bed. Mind you, the lights are still off. I walked towards him and asked him again, "What the F are you doing? Get out!" And I physically started pushing him slightly towards the door. Then he spoke. "Where's the money? Where's the money?" And like this very strange, almost fake accent. And seriously, I started laughing it off. I still thought it was my brother. Okay, I don't know if you're drunk or just being an a-hole, but get out. By this time, we were almost at the door. I was still pushing him out. He left, and I closed the door. Finally, I thought as I went back to bed, but I started feeling unsettled. I got nervous and scared and started thinking it over. Didn't I smell cigarettes? Jope doesn't smoke. Why would he act so strange? So, just to be sure, I texted my brother, "Where are you?" His answer made my heart sink to my knees. "I just left the gym, home in a minute." I immediately called him and frantically explained there was just someone in my room. I started crying as I was panicking and asked him what to do. He said to call the police and stay in my room. As the gym was really close to our home, my brother came home like literally a minute or two later. I was still upstairs on the phone with the police while I heard my brother yell a whole lot of curse words and "get out." At that point, I was in the upstairs hallway because my sister woke up and was standing there too. My father fell asleep downstairs on the couch, so when he heard my brother scream, he immediately woke up and knew something was wrong. He went to the downstairs hallway and saw my brother chasing the intruder. At this point, they were already at the front door. My brother managed to take a backpack from the intruder, but sadly he got away. My brother did get a good look at him though. So the police came and I was actually in shock. All this time my mother was asleep because she's on strong sleep meds. She woke up during the chase when my sister and I were standing in the hallway. I was crying and she came up to us. I frantically told her what had happened, and she said, "Ah, little one, that was a very bad dream." That's one of the things we still laugh about today. While we were talking to the police, we had to describe the person. I told them exactly what had happened and how he looked. Due to the streetlight, I could see the clothes he was wearing. He had a hood on, so I didn't see his face, and when I was close, he always turned his back towards me. So I'm telling the police lady about his black pants and green hoodie. Then she abruptly stopped me. "Green? Your brother said light gray." That's the second time my heart dropped to my knees. There were two guys, not one. Both my brother and I were 100% sure about what we saw, so there had to have been two guys. They took a few iPads, phones, and wallets, but luckily my brother took the backpack where there was a lot more valuable things that they didn't get away with. But the burglars were kinda stupid because we still had the Find My on all our Apple devices and they were still running. A day later, when we saw the location, my brother jumped in his car with my father while on the phone with the police. Really, my brother is a badass. Going to the gym at night, he's in the military, chasing intruders through the house. I wouldn't F with them. They waited for the police, and they went in the house where the location of our devices were, and found one guy. He was crying and covered in his own piss and puke. They arrested him and he confessed. He said he was high on drugs, and it was the first time he ever did something like that. He was very panicky and crying the whole time. My brother recognized him as the intruder he chased, so that meant the guy who was in my room was still out there. The guy snitched on the other guy, but he was nowhere to be found. We all kind of got on with our lives, but I was really scared. I slept with my lights on for more than a year, and every time I would be awake past 3 a.m., I couldn't go to sleep anymore. The intruder they caught went to jail for a year. He was a first-time offender, and is now in a rehab program. He has sent us a letter or two with our consent, and we kind of feel bad for him. He was traumatized too. But half a year ago, we heard the second man was taken into custody. I was finally over it. I mean, it wasn't as bad as the beginning, but of course, I still got scared sometimes. But now they finally caught the man that was in my room. What we found out was unsettling to say the least. While the dude that pissed himself didn't have a record before this happened, the dude who was in my room was a very experienced criminal. He had multiple possession charges, theft, drunk driving, and worst of all, assault and attempted homicide. The man I talked to, cursed out and pushed out of my room at 3 a.m., was dangerous, and I'm very happy to be alive. I worked at a tattoo shop in Arizona, across the river from Laughlin, Nevada. It was February, and people were spending tax returns on tattoos. I don't remember the exact day, but it was crazy busy. I got stuck with a family and tattooed until about 3 a.m. They were generous. After all is said and done, I had about $2,000+ in my pocket. My wife had been waiting all night for me, so in a spur-of-the-moment decision, we decided to go across the river to the casinos and spend money. I don't gamble, don't really drink, and just never been interested in that stuff. But that night, it sounded fun. As soon as we got out of the car at the first casino, is when I noticed things were odd. The valet runs up to me and looks kinda confused why I'm in my car. Like, he even looked at my car and made a joke about, "Oh, this way you can probably just drive around." I was even more confused, and I told him I would park my own car and did so. As we walked into the casino, people were looking at me, like backing up and making room for me to walk by, and nodding at me and just acting weird. My wife was like, "What's going on, man? Why is everyone treating you like this?" At first, I wrote it off to people just being nice and doing their jobs and whatnot. But it kept getting weirder. People kept staring at me and holding doors. My wife is asking me if I have some secret life or something. It didn't register at the time, but one of the bartenders said, "It's strange to see you here this time of day." It was like 4 a.m. I thought it was just small talk. For hours, I gambled roulette and kept winning. I never played roulette in my life. All night and into the morning, people kept staring at me, looking away when I locked eyes. I even walked up to some dude that was looking at me and said, "What's up?" And he just said, "Oh, hey bro, I just noticed you. I'm sorry." I was shocked. This guy was legit nervous to be talking to me. I'm not famous or a gangster or nothing. We thought maybe because I tattooed a lot of people. But I usually recognize clients, and they always treat me like a friend. Another incident, while walking between casinos, I decided to get some smokes at this gas station. And when I walked in, everyone let me go to the front of the line. There were maybe 5 people, but they all looked at me, looked away, and the cashier just said, "Hello, sir." My wife is looking at me like, what is happening? I also got a personal tour of Don Laughlin's car collection. We were trying to see the cars, but forgot it was like 4 or 5 in the morning. But this old guy showed up at the entrance and just said, "Go ahead, nobody will care if you're in there." At the time, I assumed he just meant like we were harmless and no one would care. After that, I saw this weird old slot machine that only gave away silver dollars. But it only took silver dollars. I was excited, so I went to find where I could get silver dollars to put in the machine, and the cashier just didn't understand. I told her it was for the machine, and she was adamant that there is no machine like that. I went back to find it and couldn't. It was gone. People then started bumping into me, and when I looked at them, nobody cared anymore. I think I was the doppelganger. There were more little experiences, but in a nutshell, that's it. It also seemed to end when I noticed the daylight. I don't know. I've been thinking about it for a long time and it still bothers me. I don't look like anyone famous or infamous. I actually have a piercing through the bridge of my nose that makes me fairly unique, and would be hard to get me confused with someone else. One of the things I constantly think about is I left with the exact same amount of money. We were dumping money into the machines, making crazy bets on roulette, buying food, and a lot of that money should have been gone. My first encounter with Dead Fred. My house was built in 1983 to 1985, owned by one man who was a computer mega nerd and worked for Boeing/Skunkworks, and lived there with his girlfriend/wife until 2000 when my parents bought it. I was 5, my brother 6, youngest sister 10, oldest sister 13. 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house. My brother and I shared a room. Sisters had their own. Turned last room into computer room. No deaths, no murders in it. My brother and I had a bunk bed. I slept on top. I can't say for certain how long it was before he began to stir, because I was a child and had no concept of time, so let's say 3 months. 3 months had passed after we moved in, and my brother and I during the night would wake up from sounds of heavy footsteps creaking across the attic. Then a shuffling sound, which ended up being the attic textured drywall slab door. Then it would stop. Nothing of it, kids with wild imaginations. New house, new neighbors, no friends, new babysitter, new preschool, so you just expect a kid to be scared. That was until months later. I wake up early one morning and get ready for the day of play, but something just felt extra scary when I exited the bathroom. Like I'm being watched and should get out of there kind of feeling, but from above. So I ran to my parents' door on the other side of the upstairs hallway, but was too afraid to go into the room, thinking I would get yelled at for waking them up. I remember vaguely coming up with the idea, if something is behind me, I'm at the door and can just run into my parents' room to safety. So I turned around quickly, as if to scare what was giving me a scared feeling. Nothing at first, but then I saw him. A freakishly tall being's head, slightly poking out from around the corner where the bathroom and attic door were. The attic is right above the bathroom door, but it wasn't scary. Not until I ducked back behind the wall. I ran down the hallway to the bathroom. There's no way something was there. I look up and the attic door slides closed. I ran back out towards my parents' room. When I got there, I got another sickening feeling of being watched, but this time from downstairs. I froze before I could get 3 feet from their door. I felt the urge to look again, and this time I saw him. Downstairs in front of the couch in the living room. What can be confirmed now as a 6'7", 6'8" being. Completely black, but also transparent. His facial features only partially there. No eyes, no full mouth or nose, but cheekbones and ears were clear. Long flowing black shirt like cloth. Arms and legs were only the upper halves and malnourished stature. Then Fred decided to do what my family and friends all know him for, scaring the absolute crap out of you. I looked back towards my room, thinking I should run back and hide under my covers, because monsters can't get you if you're under a blanket. Looked back to where he was, not there anymore. Nope. In fact, he was actually on all fours like a spider, climbing up the stairs. I ran to my room, slammed the door, climbed up and hid under my covers. I woke my brother up from my commotion, and I sputter what I think I just called Fred a monster. My brother, I assumed, looked outside, saw something and did the same thing, except he added a scream. About 10 minutes later, my parents come in, tell us that we're grounded from TV for the day. Occurrences like this kept going, and we eventually lost the TV from our room completely until I turned 10. Little did my parents know, my sisters gave us her old Minnie Mouse TV. It had a VHS player, and I missed that thing, hiding it in the closet under the clothes that were completely suspicious. Anyways, that was my first actual encounter with whom is now known as Dead Fred, and it still is engraved with grueling detail in my brain forever. Just a little FYI. My parents did believe us. They always did. It's a crazy active entity. Around 2010, we all came to the agreement it was a haunted house and almost everyone has seen it. I had friends that were non-believers turn to believers. There were too many encounters to count. Scratches, bruises, seeing him, doors opening/closing, things moving, footsteps, bangs that shook the rooms but not the house, and weird dreams. Also, feeding off the dying. My dad died September 6, 2020. A medium told my wife and I that the entity enjoyed every bit of pain we fed him, not even knowing it was feeding him. That it also fed off my grandma, who died of cancer in 2006. We were told a chilling, "He's smiling about it," from the medium. This entity is evil. So this happened a couple years ago when I was 13 and my brother was 11. My parents had to go out and thought it would be better to leave me and my brother home alone, so that's what they did, and they left taking my sister, age 6, with them. Me and my brother were all the way down in our basement, which is where we had our video game set up. So the two of us were just downstairs playing Mario Kart on our Wii. We had the home phone in between us, just in case one of our parents called. About an hour goes by and the phone starts to ring. We look down at the caller ID, and it's our uncle. We decided to just let it ring, and how our phone worked was it would ring about 5 times then stop. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 ring. The phone stops ringing. My brother doesn't pay attention to it, but I do. I realized that the only reason for it to stop that early is if someone picked it up. We were home alone. I got really suspicious, and my paranoia got the better of me, and I take my brother and we go upstairs. We see that the phone is still there, but there's yet one more phone on the 3rd floor in my parents' room. So we go towards the stairs, and what we saw chilled us to the bone. A man, late 40s, early 50s, is all I can really tell you, because the second we saw him, me and my brother scream, run out of our front door, and go straight to our neighbor's house. We tell them what happened, and they proceed to call the police, then our parents. They come fast, and I don't know what was wrong with the man, but he never left the house. He just stood there, and the police arrested him. From what I heard, he was placed in a mental hospital, but that's just what I heard. The story may not be totally crazy compared to others, but I just think, what could have happened to me and my brother if my uncle didn't decide to call? This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I've never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still don't know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he is still where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if it wasn't for my parents. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home was, and still is, just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest, and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles' walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondering if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. Yes, I bloody know I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north anyways, so what the hell? I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell that could have been closed in tin or something, and the river was too far away still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally. Until I found a badger, a bloomin' dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh, the body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, and so had I. So the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated while I was walking that way, I suppose. Don't really know. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour. Then decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest, when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger, with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, like an almost literal load of bullocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first, I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain. My senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I had just shit out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raised despite being soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear, combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly, was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing up my lungs, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure where they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-running, half-speed walk thing again because I was out of breath. Then I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder, and that's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had a secret sprinting ability, or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers. But when I tell you I ran for my life, I flippin' didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They're on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car, ready to leave fast. We went directly to the police station, and I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car, said he could hear the bell, and thought he wouldn't be able to see me. Asked what if I hadn't had my phone? What if he hadn't picked up? They were almost as terrified as I was, because they heard everything through the call. They could hear me trying to run, and they could hear the danger. They just couldn't see it. The police couldn't really do much. They searched the area, and the only thing they found was a folded t-shirt placed under a rock. I didn't really question that at the time, and my bag was not recovered. They said it was probably some homeless man living in the forest, but failed to realize what could have happened if my dad didn't know that part of the forest like I did, and where to find me. I'm not blaming anyone. The entire thing was my fault. There are just so many what-ifs. I want to believe it was just someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt or something. Maybe they were a bit mentally unstable and they felt angry that I came into their territory. But what if it was more insidious? The way he moved towards me was abnormal. It was perverse because of how slowly he was ringing the bell. It's like he had me trapped. I didn't see any more detail, I just ran. To this day, I can't bloody go anywhere where I'll be alone, and the sound of bells is a real problem. The smell of moss as well. Anyways, my parents and Steve Jobs saved my life, so go hug yours now. And take decapitated badgers and bells as pagan signs that you're unwelcome. I went to college in Moorhead, Kentucky, and this was back in 2017, I think. There are these old mining caves called the Mushroom Mines, and they aren't in use anymore, but it is a hot spot for spooks and exploring. People always say crazy stuff goes down there, like cult rituals and etc. But I only believe the occasional drug deal or something. Someone said police found a goat cut in half down the center of its face there, but I never saw evidence of that, so I don't believe it even today. Me, my friend Teddy, and my boyfriend at the time decided to go to the caves around 2 or 3 p.m. one afternoon after class. I can't remember who, but I think we had 1 or 2 other friends with us, maybe Teddy's friend, because I honestly can't remember. When we got there, there was another car parked outside the caves, and it seemed like it didn't belong to anyone crazy. It was a lime green little thing, clean as what we could see, with the windows rolled down, maybe because it was hot as hell outside at the time. No one was around that we could see, though. That wasn't really weird, because there were a lot of hiking trails next to the cave, and no one was in the mouth of the cave, so we assumed that they must be hiking. So we're exploring the mouth of the cave and only go maybe 10 to 20 feet deep, because if you've been to a mine or deep cave before that isn't in use anymore, you know it's pitch freaking black and cold. We did have flashlights, but we still weren't trying to go a mile in or anything. All of a sudden, Teddy just asks, "Did you guys see that?" This immediately sends chills down my spine, and I think he's just trying to scare us. My boyfriend goes to where he's standing and asks what he saw. As Teddy is explaining that he thinks he saw a small light turn on way deeper down in the cave, a small light clicks on, way further than we are down in the cave, as if it's reacting to his acknowledgement. It was a light from a flashlight. It clicks back off, and we take a second, and we get the hell out of there. So guys, I don't know what to think of this at all. They didn't have their light on when we first showed up, so they were what? Just hanging out down there, in the dark? They didn't say hi to us, or speak at all, and it's weird that it seems like they almost tried to get one of our attention, instead of again just calling out and greeting us all. They also had no idea we were coming, or that anyone would be coming. We had all skipped our afternoon classes, so most students wouldn't even maybe be there until 5 to 6 to explore. Please tell me what you all think. I haven't gone back since. Obviously, I don't think it was a monster or ghost. But if anything, people freak me out more, especially ones who hang out in old mines alone with no light. A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to a forest nearby our house. We were in Poland for the holidays, as every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So one day, we decided to take out my mom's old tent she still had from like the 90s, and just stay for the night or two in between some wildlife. Good thing. The place we chose to sleep at was only about 20, maybe 30 minutes away from the house. Bad thing. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of wolves, foxes, and boars out in that forest. And honestly, I kind of regretted going out there in the first place. We set everything up at around 6 p.m., and my sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe, important for later part of the story, and by now it had dried out enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours, until it was dark, so we decided to just head to sleep then. My two sisters and I on one end of the tent, and my parents on the other. It was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves, or homesickness, but I couldn't sleep at all. I heard my dad tell my mom he was going out into the forest to get some wood for the morning while it was still fairly dry, or it would have soaked up all the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to even close my eyes for a second. I'm not too good at telling what time it is by just staring at the sky, or trying to figure out how long it has been, so I'll just say it was around 12 or 1 in the morning. I was actually falling asleep when I heard some rattling outside my tent. My first thought, wolf. I was terrified and so just popped out my head through the little curtain that separated the two halves of the tent. Basically a thin piece of fabric just hanging on some threads, to see if my dad was back. He was still gone, and it had been about an hour since he went. I lay back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side, I saw this faint human shadow outside the tent. I froze and let out a teeny squeak. The person seemed to be holding some sort of axe, shovel-type thing in its hand, and so I thought it may have just been my dad coming back. The shadow walked towards the entrance of the tent and just stood there, at the zipped-up door for maybe 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside. The person finally ran off into the forest, but it dropped the axe. You could hear the footsteps fade in the distance and a thump just appear along the way. Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and enter the tent all tired and just fell asleep. Seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late I couldn't even think anymore and I somehow fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air because I was feeling a bit sick. Maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness, I couldn't really tell. Both of us got out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for around 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. That's when I noticed something that ran the chills down my back. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize I actually saw something, and when I turned my head to see what it was a red and black rubber axe. It was not there before. I knew it wasn't my dad's, because his was by the pile of wood he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because he started to freak out a little, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared for a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour and we rushed back home. I later told my dad what I saw that night, and he wouldn't believe me at first. I carried on with the story, and he finally realized I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the heck that was, but I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further or any other animal out there in that forest. To the axe man who was outside my tent in the middle of the night, let's not meet. This happened to one of my friends. He and 2 of his buddies decided to go camping one weekend in the Uinta Mountains in Utah. They wanted to go out in the middle of nowhere to really get away from civilization and just chill and fish and stuff like that. All three of them are pretty outdoorsy and experienced with camping and backpacking, so this was no big deal for them. They went to a trailhead in the Uintas, hiked about half a mile up the trail, and then turned off the trail and just hiked for about 4 more miles away from the trail. They had little trail markers so that they wouldn't get lost coming back. They find a spot, and there's no sign of anyone around. The ground looks untouched by humans. There was also a brook close by, so they decided to set up camp. All three of them had camping hammocks, so they set those up in the trees, and then just kind of explored around for a bit before they decided to build a fire and eat and stuff like that. Eventually, the evening rolled around, so they built a fire and made tinfoil dinners and were just shooting the shit. When they decided to go to bed, the guy who told me this said he remembered laying in his sleeping bag in his hammock, thinking that even though there was the sound of water in the brook close by, and every now and then there'd be like insect noises or whatever, the woods were so quiet. Like, being out of civilization made him realize how rarely we as humans experience real silence, since we all fill our days with so many noises and distractions. He said it felt eerie. He could feel himself starting to doze off, when the worst thing in the world happened to him. He had to pee when already comfy and warm. He figured he'd rip the Band-Aid off and go pee before he fell asleep for the night. He put on his headlamp, got out of his hammock, and walked about 30 feet away from his buddies in their hammocks to pee. When he was walking over, he thought he saw something dart out of sight unnaturally fast and heard a crack of a branch. But because they were so far out in the wilderness near a brook, he didn't think too much of it. He unzipped his pants, peed, and then right when he was zipping his pants back up, his headlamp shone on something on the ground that paralyzed him with fear. A few feet away from where he was peeing were, unmistakably, fresh human footprints on the ground. It had rained in the mountains the day before, so the earth was soft in some areas, and there was no doubt in his mind that these were not only human footprints, but that whoever made the footprints was barefoot. The creepiest thing was that the footprints weren't staggered, they were side by side, facing where these guys were camping. It was as though someone was just standing still at the edge of their camping spot in total darkness, just watching them. Those were the only footprints my friend could see. No other prints leading to or away from the ones he saw. Totally freaked out, he ran back to his hammock and got his knife that he always takes camping. He loudly whispered his two friends' names, but they were already asleep, so they didn't answer. He debated whether he should wake them up, but decided against it because there was no real physical threat he could think of that would justify waking them up. He put his headlamp on a brighter setting and shone it up in the trees and around the general area of where he had peed. Nothing. He didn't sleep that night. He laid in his hammock wide awake with his knife in his hand all night. Those footprints looked as though someone had been standing there moments before he walked up to that spot to pee. He felt like he and his friends were not alone. When it reached early in the morning, when the sun just barely started to rise, my friend decided he was going to pack his stuff up because he was still spooked and wanted to start hiking back to their car when his friends were up. When he was taking down his hammock, he saw another set of fresh footprints. But this time they were like 10 feet away from his hammock, like on the edge of the trees behind his hammock, as if someone had been standing about 10 feet away from his hammock, just staring at him. Again, no other footprints leading to these two footprints. He was full on freaked out by this point, so he woke up his friends and showed them the footprints, and they got the hell out of there. Sometimes you're not as alone as you think you are. This is long, and I'm not sorry. I've been asked to write about this, so here goes. Back in 1989, I was with my boyfriend Eddie, his best friend, my older sister Angie, and about 6 other people. We had spent the entire day mudding in the Royal Palm Mudflaps in Royal Palm Beach, Florida, also known as part of Palm Beach County. I grew up in West Palm Beach. I had never seen anything like this before or since. After mudding all day, we decided to call it a night and leave. Almost everyone was gone by then, so we all piled into Eddie's truck and left. Eddie saw a small mud hole and drove through it as one last hooray for the night. We got stuck. That small hole was deceptive. When I say we got stuck, I mean we were stuck for hours. I was pregnant with my first, so I was steering as the other 9 were pushing. That truck didn't budge. We had no choice but to wait until morning for someone to come pull us out, as we were now on our own. At about 5 a.m., we decided we should just relax and try to sleep until someone came through. Eddie, I, and his bestie were in the front. My sister and the other 6, who are all still friends with to this day, piled into the back and started to settle down. We were still making noise when I heard a sound. It was a rumbling growl. I knew immediately that it was some type of animal. I told everyone to hush and listen. Then we all heard it, and it was getting louder and more aggressive sounding. Eddie has a KC light behind his seat. He popped out, grabbed it, plugged it in, and lit the night up. That's when our world changed. 10 of us had our world rocked in a way we never expected. This thing ducked down and moved. Everyone was starting to freak out because it was clearly there, but what was it? Then it got pissed. This thing stood straight up, let out a roar that I can still hear 31 years later, leapt the large bush it was standing behind, and charged us. You could feel the earth literally shake with every running step it took. It was easily 8 to 9 feet tall. It was broad. It looked like an extremely large man with hair. Not fur. It had hair and lots of it. The KC light lit it up, and you could see the clumping of the hair. The smell was rotten and sour. Being pregnant, I was extremely sensitive to smells, and it was bad. We had spent hours, we're talking 5+ hours, trying to push this truck out. They say adrenaline gives you super strength. They're right. Eddie turned on his truck and started pushing on his door frame. His bestie leapt out his side and did the same. My sister and the other 6 let out screams as they piled out. And then all you heard was this thing running and roaring. Everyone else was dead silent as they put everything they had into pushing this truck out. With a sucking pop that I also can still hear, we were out and they were throwing themselves in the back as Eddie and his bestie jumped in and he floored it. This is woods with tight turns, and we flew around those turns. It felt like the devil himself was chasing us. After we got out and onto the main road, we headed for a gas station to calm down and call our families. When we got there, we all got out, sat with our backs to the wall, and that was it. We never said a word to each other, just silence. I think we were too raw, scared, and in complete shock over what happened. This was lore. This wasn't real. They don't exist. Yet there it was. After we all called our parents, we went home, one by one being dropped off. Not a word spoken. My sister and I did not discuss this until about 5 years ago. We finally opened up about that night and have slowly talked to the others. 25 years after the fact, and every single one of us that have spoken about it have the same exact story and memory forever burned into our minds. It wasn't cool. It was scary. I think the reason we couldn't talk about it for so long was because our brains were in denial at first, and then we didn't know how to open up about it. Now I can look back and say, holy crap, we saw freaking Bigfoot. I'll try to make this as short as possible, but I'll add some context first. It was 3 years ago this month. I was at the hospital with my 10-year-old daughter because my stepdad was dying and only had a couple of days to live. I had been there all day, and at 10:40 p.m., my mom said, "Son, it's almost 11. Go home, get some sleep, and I'll see you in the morning." I said okay, told everyone goodbye, and headed for the parking garage. As I pulled out of the parking lot and grabbed my phone to call my wife to let her know that I was leaving, I noticed it was exactly 11 p.m. The hospital is 58 miles away. The hospital is 58 miles away and is almost exactly an hour from my house. The 2-lane highway I took, I've been down a million times my whole life. I live in southern Illinois, and it's the fastest way to get to Kentucky where the hospital is. The first half of the drive is fairly flat, and then it is constant hills once you get to the Shawnee National Forest. It's extremely rural, with no streetlights, stop signs, or traffic lights the whole way, except one highway you drive over with a streetlight on the east side of the road, which is almost halfway to my house from the hospital. Anyway, me and my daughter were just driving over the Ohio River when I realized I really had to piss. With no gas stations or businesses until I get home, 55 miles away, I decide that worst case scenario, I'll hold it until the halfway point with the streetlight, pull off the road and take a piss. About 10 minutes into the trip, when I'm driving through a very straight section of highway with cornfields on both sides, a really dense fog comes out of the east cornfield and completely covers everything. It was hard to see any further than 30 feet in front of me, but I couldn't see anything on the sides of me. It was like driving through a tunnel. You can't see anything except forward. Because it was deer season, I wanted to be cautious, so I had my daughter sitting up and looking for deer from her side of the road, just in case. After another 20 minutes or so, this really strong feeling came over me. It was pure confusion and panic. I felt lost. I realized that I should have been to that streetlight by now, but I hadn't even made it to the hilly parts of the road yet. So I asked my daughter if she's seen any lights on the side of the road. No. Have you seen any other cars? No, I haven't even seen any other houses. I told her we just couldn't see them because of the fog and kept driving. Didn't want her to be freaked out like me. Then I realized we're at least 45 minutes into this trip. We haven't seen any cars, lights, and the road has been straight this entire time. So we must be lost. I pick up the phone to call my fiancée when the fog suddenly breaks, and my confusion goes through the roof when I realize we are just outside a small town, about 10 to 15 minutes from my house. While the town is on the way home, we never went up a single hill or around a curve. One curve on the way is almost 90 degrees, and the speed limit around it is 45 miles per hour, so there is no way to miss it. I spent the last 10 minutes driving home trying to rationalize what had just happened. The scariest explanation I had come to was I fell asleep and somehow managed to drive 45 miles up and down steep hills and around sharp curves with my daughter in the car next to me. As bad as that made me feel, it gave me some kind of relief, because it gave me an explanation of what just happened. That all changed once I got home. I parked the car, got the kiddo and her stuff, and was walking in the door to tell my wife sorry it took so long. Except, when we walked in the door, she had a shocked look on her face and said, "How did you get here so fast?" Thinking she was being a smartass, I said, "Sorry, it was a weird drive. There was really bad fog, and I couldn't see anything most of the way, and that's why it took so long." Her, "What do you mean it took so long? I just talked to you on the phone 20 minutes ago when you called and said you were leaving." Me, "That was over an hour ago. I called you at 11 o'clock. Her, "Babe, I know, but it's 11:20. I looked up at the clock and it was 11:20. Checked my phone, 11:20. Went to the kitchen and checked the stove, 11:20. Checked my phone again, and I did call her at 11. I was freaked out, so I pulled her outside and quietly explained to her what had happened, so my daughter wouldn't hear anything and become as freaked out as we were. We couldn't come up with any explanation, so we go to sleep, because I had to be back at the hospital as early as possible. We never spoke about it again. We just forgot about it overnight. I didn't even remember it happening the next day. Then just about a week ago, all that changed. I was telling my wife about a comment I read on here, about a girl and her parents road tripping. Coming up on some dense fog, they were lost, so they stopped at a gas station they'd never seen before. But some weird guy there just kept telling them to leave. Something about the story seemed really familiar to me. And then out of nowhere, my daughter says, "Dad, that reminds me of that creepy fog we drove through when Papa was in the hospital." I asked her what fog, and she was telling me in detail what happened and how she was scared because of how freaked out I looked. I remembered everything, which really freaked me out that I had forgotten what had happened. Then it all just came back to me at once. We talked about it, and we both remembered it the same way. The only exception being was she told me the look on my face scared her because she knew something was wrong when I thought I played the tough, fearless dad role to a T. I know it happened 3 years ago, but since I forgot about it, somehow I've only had a week to analyze it. The only things I've ruled out was the time changing. Where I live and where the hospital is are both the same time zone. My stepdad died in October and time didn't change until November. I honestly have no explanation for what happened, but I've thought about it every day since I remembered it a week ago. For a little background story, I've been a scout since I was 8 years old, and last year I was the leader of my team, so I had to do all the paperwork and calls for finding places to camp. It was mid-November. I had to find a place to camp, but since I was lazy, I decided to wait a week before the actual weekend. A week before the weekend, I decided to call some owners so I can have a place to sleep. As I call many numbers, all of the owners are unavailable or simply not there. But then I see a number which I never called before, since it's at the end of the list. I called, and an old lady picked up the phone. I do the basic presentation and all. She agreed to let me and my team stay at her place, and we make all the arrangements. That afternoon, I go to her property to check everything such as potable water, the place to put the tent, and the campfire. The place is kind of dark, but it's nice. The week passes and Saturday arrives. The Saturday ended well. We did some great games, we ate a lot, and we had a good night show. As they go to sleep in the tent, I stay awake to finish paperwork for the next day. It's now around midnight, and I decide to go to sleep because we have to wake up early to go to church. As I switch off the flashlight, one of the newbies, there were 8 in total, wants to go to the toilets, also known as a tree, and asks me to come with her. I can understand because it's better to be accompanied in the night, especially in the woods. She does her business, and I suddenly hear some noises far away, but not that far. I tell myself it's nothing. It must be some animals trying to find food. We go back to the tent, and that's when I hear footsteps approaching. As I hear those footsteps, I remain calm and tell myself maybe it's the old lady making sure we didn't make a fire too close or something. But I still have an odd feeling because it's midnight, and why would she do that at that hour? Then I hear no more footsteps for about 10 minutes. Then I hear more coming to our tents. Thankfully, all of my girls are sleeping because they would have been scared. As I hear footsteps, which seems to come from one person, I hear others coming from the back of the tent. And I was like, okay, this is getting weird. I need to do something. I check by the side of the tent, and thank God, one of the newbies left some embers from the fire, so I could see what happens between the fire and the zip of the tent. A minute passes by, and a silhouette is there just between the fire and my tent. I stopped breathing. I literally froze. I started to move towards my phone when I saw the silhouette coming closer to the zipper of the tent. I sent the message to one of my bosses who was always camping in the near areas if something happened, but I knew she would take too long, so I had to think of something, and think fast. That's when I had an idea. I put my alarm on like a big siren, because sometimes we would do like night games and wake up in the middle of the night. So I put my bell on, and my girls woke up. The silhouette had started to unzip the tent. I actually saw fingers from below. But as the silhouette heard my girls waking up, she or he sprinted back to where he came from. That's when I saw 2 other silhouettes sprinting back in the same direction. Everything ended well, and 20 minutes later my boss came and stayed the night, and I never had to deal with those silhouettes again, thankfully. When I was 19, working unarmed security, I was placed as a flex officer at a retirement home, while the regular officer went on vacation. The first 2 shifts were learning the main care hospice building and learning the apartment and cottage buildings for the independent seniors. Usually, we only had to check the outer buildings a couple of times a night to make sure no one was wandering around or no wildlife were getting in the trash. But my experiences began in the main building on the second shift after the regular officer had left for his vacation. One of the morbid duties that didn't happen very often was escorting a body from the facility with the coroner and usually the family of the resident. On that night, a very elderly woman passed around 1 a.m., with her daughter and grandsons around her. Just after 1:45 a.m., I greeted the coroner at the service entrance, and we took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The ride was unsettling. Both myself and the coroner were in absolute silence during that elevator ride that seemed to take for hours. My eyes were fixated on the gurney donning a reddish body bag with a funeral home logo. I stood at the room door as the family cried as the nurse and coroner took possession of the woman's now lifeless form. All of us, including the family, walked onto the elevator to go to the ground level to see her off in the medical van, and as it pulled away, the grandsons thanked and shook my hand for my assistance, though I felt as I had done nothing. For the rest of the night, it seemed slow yet eerie. I kept thinking about that gurney with the body bag and how life is uncertain. The following night, I was sitting at the welcome desk, sitting across from the on-duty nurse who had dozed off. I was reading a book about the history of the occult when I noticed from across the main reception hall, where entertainers or youth groups come to lighten the spirits of the residents, the dessert carousel machine with its dim soft white light flickered. It didn't flicker due to an electric default, but instead as if someone was standing in front of it or walked past it. I walked out to see if a resident was maybe looking for a late-night treat, but the area was void of anyone but myself. I brushed off the oddity as just my eyes acting up, but as soon as I returned to the desk, the grand piano that sat halfway between the dessert carousel and my desk struck 3 keys. I began to get spooked, so I decided now was the best time to do a property check. As I was returning down the last resident hall towards the reception area, I heard the music of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I felt my blood go cold. I staggered towards the reception area, hoping to see a resident or even the nurse. But as soon as I hit the threshold into the reception area, it fell dead silent. I nervously checked to see if it were a player's piano, but found that it required a pianist. As I was still inspecting the piano with my light, the nurse walked over. "Why did you stop playing? It was really nice." I turned with confusion and a little fear. That wasn't me. The nurse's face went white. "Stone, do you know what time it is?" She extended her wrist to where I saw the time, 1:07 a.m. We both went out to the smoking area, which was absolutely not permitted for resident safety reasons. Shortly after, the nurse refused to be left alone, so I accompanied her while she did her rounds checking on all the residents. While on the 3rd floor, 2 doors down from the recently deceased woman's room, we heard faint music. The family was still in the process of removing her items. One item left on her nightstand we found was the source of the soft, haunting song. Sitting there was a small music box, playing a haunting version of Moonlight Sonata. So I don't really know how to explain this, or if it even fits on the sub, or even what actually happened if I'm being honest. But regardless, I will try to relay the story. I was driving to work this morning, and I'm coming up a side street that connects to a very busy road in my area. It's the main road that stretches through like 20 towns. I get to the red light at this main road and sit there for about 15 seconds before seeing a car pull up behind me. As the car comes to a complete stop behind me, my eyes drift from the rear view mirror to the stoplight in front of me. It was red still. I then look down to my radio clock and it says 7:36. And this is going to sound strange, but for a period of time that seemed to stretch on until infinity, I kind of felt like this intense pressure all around me. Like I was zoned out and couldn't clear my head or move my body because I was obsessed with those numbers I was seeing. Like I was in a trance or something, and it wasn't silent around me, but it was at the same time, like very, very loud, pressing silence. I couldn't move, but I also wasn't trying to move. Almost like I was paralyzed with fear and knew I was frozen, but couldn't really process it or try to move. I don't know, I really can't explain it. Even now, it's so confusing to me. After who knows how long of being stuck in this trance, suddenly everything snaps back to normal. Instantly, the very first thing I register is that the person behind me is laying on their horn. I look up and see the light is green. I begin to drive forward, feeling completely 100% normal again, and once I get into the middle of the intersection, I sense this large presence to the left of me. I turn my head to look out my driver's side window just in time to see a huge truck coming right at me. It hits me, and I could feel my body break. I felt and heard so many of my bones get absolutely crushed. Suddenly, I'm upside down in my car, in so much pain I can hardly breathe, covered in glass, and I can hear someone screaming. The last thing I remember before passing out about 10 seconds later was seeing cop lights and distinctly thinking to myself, wow, how did they get here so fast? The next thing I remember, I open my eyes and I'm sitting in my car at the red light. The intense pain I felt a moment ago is fading fast, but it's still there. Only almost like a ghost version of itself, if that makes sense. I'm intensely confused at this point, and I just start looking around in a panicky way, and my eyes trail across the clock again. It says 7:36, and I'm beyond confused. I know it wasn't a daydream. It was so goddamn real. I'm frozen in place, staring at the clock, trying to figure out what the fuck just happened. After about 5 to 10 seconds, I hear the person behind me start to beep at me, but I'm shaking and about to cry, and so overwhelmed with leftover fear that I can't even react to it. They start to lay on their horn, and I still can't move because I'm just so confused and frightened. Now, at this point, I was starting to calm myself down and trying to rationalize what happened. I was beginning to convince myself that it had to have been just a daydream. It was early enough, and I was tired enough that I even started to think that I just dozed off at the red light and dreamed the crash. What the hell else could have happened, right? If it weren't for what happened next, I probably would have been able to go the rest of my life believing I had fallen asleep and dreamed it. The moment the clock turned 7:37, like the very second the numbers changed, a huge truck comes barreling through the light, definitely speeding. They ran their red light and crossed right in front of my car. A few seconds later, a cop, who must have just been driving behind the truck in the first place, runs the red light as well, turning on his lights in the process and beginning to pursue the speeding truck. They both drove out of my view within a few seconds. I was so shaken, I just pulled my car to the side of the road right where I was and sat there in silence for I don't even know how long. Like, what normal explanation could I possibly come up with for this? There isn't one. I hadn't seen the truck or the cop car before they ran the light in front of me. So how did the dream crash I had include those very specific and very real details? The entire area I live in is covered in trees, so it's not like I can see very far down the road in either direction. I know for a fact I did not see the truck or the cop car before I experienced the crash. I'm still so shaken. How do I rationalize this crazy experience to myself? I feel disillusioned by something, but I don't even know what. I feel like I'm going crazy. I need to share this with people who won't automatically dismiss this as an hallucination or a dream. So this happened when I was much younger. I want to say freshman in high school, probably like 2008. There used to be this road near where I lived in California called Croak Road. It was barely a road, no one traveled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forest and some abandoned barns and houses. I would typically go there with my friends to skateboard and hang out. This one night, I was hanging out with two of my friends, Lucas and Dorian, and someone wanted to go to Croak Road to hang out since it was creepy at night. It might sound lame, but we loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders, and weren't really into smoking or anything, so what else was there to do? I asked my 20-year-old brother, James, if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. Soon, one particular path we were traveling down had become so narrow, James' Ford Explorer couldn't pass through it. So we got out and walked for a while, chatting and just having fun. We walked through the woods for about half an hour until it had gotten relatively dark out and the sun was gone. At which point we turned around to head back to the car. It's now I should mention that despite being near a lot of subdevelopments, this patch of forest was huge. I'd say about 1,000 acres, and rarely visited since it was easy to get lost in, especially at night. It was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James managed it, and we were off down the road. Dorian proposed we turn down a different path we had passed by earlier, since we had about 40 minutes until our parents wanted us back, and we agreed. Down this path was a tiny pond Dorian wanted to check out to take pictures of, since he hadn't gotten the opportunity to visit it at night. It was slow going since this road was even crappier than the main one we were traveling on that turned off to Crook Road. Minutes later, we got into a slight argument. Dorian was convinced James had taken a wrong turn since we should have arrived at the pond by now, while James claimed that he had been driving straight the whole time. It was dark after all. Eventually, we came to a fork in the road that none of us were familiar with. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up guessing and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead us back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything. In fact, we were actually excited and intrigued, driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night. It was at this point we rounded a small bend in the road, and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. There were 4 figures emerging from the forest and crossing the road, wearing what looked to be long cloaks with the hoods up and holding flashlights. One guy at the back of the group was dragging a large duffel bag, a human-sized duffel bag. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation, and as soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they froze as well. James pulled to the left and went around them. Driving past them felt like an eternity, because we couldn't have been going over 5 miles an hour due to the shitty condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them inches beyond my window, and they were indeed wearing black robes and holding flashlights. I didn't get a good look at the bag, but judging by the way the guy was holding it, something heavy was inside the bag. None of us said a word until the road straightened out and we were past these guys, at which point James just muttered, "What the hell was that?" We continued down the road in silence until I heard Lucas say, "Holy shit!" and repeat himself in a louder, much more panicked voice. He said, "They're coming back!" I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing out the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away we saw the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. The guys were without a doubt running after us. All of us screamed at James to floor it, and he sped down the road. The car was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we flew over berms and potholes. I kept my eyes on the flashlight beams until we rounded another bend in the road, and they were out of sight. Thankfully, the path did manage to take us back to the main path. James gunned it down the path until we popped off by Croak Road and got the hell out of there. The weirdest thing about it was, there couldn't have been a vehicle anywhere near those guys for 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen one if there had been. We had explored most of the area before, and there wasn't anywhere to pull off the road and park. We didn't say anything more until we got back to my place. We talked about it for a bit, and then my friends went home and James and I went to bed. I didn't know if we should call the cops or not, but James, who I'd guess would be the adult in the situation, seemed reluctant, so I dropped it. I never told my parents until just before writing this, and they kind of scolded me for not telling them, and that we should have contacted the authorities, just to report the suspicious people in the preserve. I still wish to know how the hell they got there, where they were going, and what was in the bag. I'm an armed private security officer in Colorado Springs, and over the last few months, my company has been doing a specific property check within a community we already patrol at night. 1315 Wood Ave has an interesting past, better known as the Burns Mansion on the Old Millionaires Row in the Old North End. James Ferguson Burns, who died in Colorado Springs, was a very wealthy man across his numerous endeavors in the greater Colorado area. His death was suspected in the mansion on September 23, 1917, as well as a few servants on the property. Earlier this year, 2020, acting as an 8-unit apartment building, a suspicious death occurred on the property, prompting the city to step in. After conducting the police and forensic investigation of the death, the city immediately shut down the entire property to be renovated and brought up to modern code. But this event displaced all the tenants and families with no warning. It was said that James Burns dabbled in spiritualism via spirit boards and mediums. On the night of September 21st, I was the patrol officer on duty for that area. Our normal SOP for the property is to check around the enormous house to ensure the primary structure is secured, and that area homeless have not made entry. After dismounting from my cruiser, I began to check the street side of the property, starting with the front cellar access, which had no out-of-the-normal signs, a discarded coffee cup from one of the contractors and a few piles of wood, etc. I started towards the grand patio that nearly wraps the whole front-facing side. At the far end, I noticed the porch swing was slightly swaying side to side, not back and forth, but thought nothing of it as this home is an old location. I then began around to the rear of the mansion, and as soon as I came around the gate, I heard a staggered, elderly man's voice faintly coming from the servants' quarters on the second floor of the carriage house. So instead of checking the rear of the mansion first, I followed SOP and went straight to investigate the sounds. At the mouth to the carriage house was all the discarded personal items of the tenants that were displaced and they were unable to collect, making a path to the stairs an uneasy trek. Old furniture, toys, photos, and the like covered most of the ground. While trying not to fall while making my way, I heard the elderly voice again, but it was still faint and unintelligible. Now knowing that the possibility of an intruder was nearly 100%, I drew my sidearm and clasped my light between my fingers. I announced myself in the loudest commanding tone I could manage, leaving no doubt that I wouldn't be heard. After the second attempt of commanding that anyone identify themselves failed, I moved up the stairs. The second level was in such a state of decay that it looked as if it were a setting for a horror movie. After clearing the small 4-room area, I had only a small walk-in closet left, thinking surely this is where the subject was. I kept my sidearm level as I whipped the door open with my opposite hand. Nothing. There was nothing in that space. I holstered, thinking maybe I just had too much or too little caffeine, or a raccoon was being playful. I exited the carriage house to resume checking the mansion door barricades to ensure they were either locked or undamaged. While at the parlor doorway, I saw a shadow from behind the door under the slight split at the bottom. Aggravated, I ran to the parlor window, flashing the entire room to see who in the hell was walking around inside. Again, nothing. No sign that anything had been inside since earlier that day. Now pissed that so many weird things were happening, I checked the rest of the doors, which were all locked. I headed back to the cruiser and lit a cigarette. As I took a long, exasperated drag, the inside lights flicked off briefly. I looked up to the second floor, where a discolored face peered out before the lights sprang back on. I flicked my cigarette butt and said to myself, yeah, screw that. Jumped into the car and called out, 1315 code 4, clearing. Some years ago, my group of friends decided to celebrate my birthday by going all together on a weekend trip to a nearby city. In order to go there, we borrowed a 7-seat van from one of my friend's parents. After we packed all our stuff in the van, there was no room left for more bags or backpacks, and all 7 seats were taken. Or that was the general feeling. After some hours on the road, we had the need for a bathroom and gas stop, so we took the first highway exit with a gas icon. It happened to be one of those gas stations that aren't just on the side of the highway, but one where you have to drive a few minutes on a secondary road to get there. As we arrived there, we all felt weird. There was something unsettling about that place. Nothing we can point at directly, but we all noticed it. There were comments like, kind of place for being killed, abducted, and mentions to movies with weird supernatural towns like Silent Hill. Well, we needed to pee and refill the tank. Also, apparently, there was nothing wrong with the place, besides the general feeling, so we stopped there and do our business. Then, when everyone got into the van and we were leaving the place, someone pointed out that we now have a free seat in the van, so we stopped. We hadn't even left the gas station, and started joking about leaving him, the owner of this empty seat, there for not getting in the van when we all did. Then we tried to find who was the one left behind, but apparently we were all in the van. It was like if we were always 6 people. We have luggage for 6 people, only 6 seats were in use. Every personal item in the van was from one of us. After some minutes checking, we concluded that we made some mistake, and we were actually 6 people all the time and left the gas station. But the something is wrong feeling was with us for the whole trip. We even have a dinner reservation made a few days before the trip for the next day, and it was for 7 people. I don't know what happened in that gas station, but I'm almost sure we were 7 before stopping there, and somehow one of us was erased from reality. I was about 18 years old when this took place, so only a couple of years ago. One of my best friends, let's call him Nick, used to live a couple towns over. It was the summer right after we graduated, and we used to hang out all the time. So there was a solid month or two where I would go to his neighborhood, and we would smoke for hours on end in my car. His neighborhood was a very quaint suburban area with lots of old people living there. We had a couple of spots we would regularly park for our sessions, and sometimes we would use this somewhat popular forest trail at the front of his neighborhood. You would see lots of people running, walking, or biking through there throughout the day. One evening, we decided that we would smoke on this trail. This wasn't out of the ordinary for us at this point. We walked maybe a mile and a half into this trail and casually chatted and joked around as friends do. Eventually we found a bench where we sat down and started smoking and talking about our days and topics of our interest. We saw a middle-aged gentleman briefly jog by us as we sat on the bench. That was the only person we saw during our walk through the trail. By the time we finished smoking, the sun has already gone down and it was getting dark, so we mentioned going back to the car to keep rolling up and continuing our session. We started walking back the way we came from. Nick and I were talking about whatever, I can't remember what we were talking about, since it was casual and we've already gotten into the routine of just shooting the shit all the time. Eventually, as we continued walking, it became eerily darker. So dark I couldn't see much, and I was trying to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I got to a point where my eyes were adjusted to it, so the trail had a more bluish hint to it instead of a pitch black, kind of like how horror movies try portraying the night. Although the forest line around us in the distance was still so dark you couldn't see into it. As Nick and I were making our way through the trail, we got to a point where the trail was straight, with a bend at the end of it, cutting off our vision from the rest of the path. Couldn't have been any further than 150, 200 feet where the cutoff seemed to be. Nick was on my right side as we were chatting, shoulder to shoulder, walking at the same pace. As we were walking, a small beam of light seemed to be cutting through the dark shroud of trees ahead of us, slightly to the left of the trail, still in front of us, but not on the pathway. In my head, without any concern of the light, I assumed it was the moonlight reflecting off the riverbank to the right of us, but as we continued walking towards it, I noticed that the beam of light was moving as well. I was talking at this moment, and as my eyes began locking onto this figure, my words slowly started to drift away into a dead silence. To my surprise, Nick was also locked on this weird light figure. Our pace slowed down as we were quietly watching this figure emerging from the forest. It was a whitish gray figure that seemed unfazed by the ground as it was moving in our direction in the distance. Nick eventually broke our silence and asked me, "Do you see that?" He knew I was looking at it as well. Neither Nick or I are religious or believe in spirits, and my brain started to try to come up with the most logical answer, so I quickly replied, "I think it's just the moonlight." To which he responded, "I don't think so." Now, the figure was maybe 60 feet away, and we could tell it was a human shape. It had legs, it had shoulders that moved in the pace of its stride, although not seeming to be fazed by the pitch-black ground beneath it. I started to get scared. It looked like a woman in a white dress walking towards us with white legs, arms, and head, although no hair could be seen. Knowing all too well what that means in horror movies, my mind began racing for a more rational conclusion. I thought to myself, well, maybe it's a man in a white coat walking on the trail, but that only left me with the question as to why a man would be walking into the trail this late at night. My heart began pounding as this woman with a white glow started coming closer and closer. I tried so hard to make a face out in the night, but I could only see the distinct white figure of her. She had the glow of the moon. Everything from head to toe was all white. Nick and I, at this point, halted in our tracks at the same time, locking onto this glowing woman who was walking directly into our path. We could tell that if she were to continue walking towards us, she would have to walk through us. She was dead center on the path, continuously walking closer and closer. At this point, I was so terrified and completely suspended in disbelief. Besides the odd occasion of a door shutting at random in my house, I have never seen what seemed to be a spirit, so clearly I could see this woman in a dress. Although I was scared out of my mind, an overwhelming sense of tranquility was coming over me, like I had nothing to be afraid of. The woman became so close, she couldn't have been more than 20, maybe 30 feet in front of us at this moment. So close you could guess her height, which was tall enough to be somewhat eye level with me, yet no eyes or distinct facial features besides possibly the shape of a nose. I can't begin to express how clear and close the woman got to us. Dead in our tracks, eyes locked on her, we sat there silently watching her getting ready to walk in between us. Without any thought to it, simultaneously Nick and I locked eyes with each other. The look of horror and confusion in his eyes reassured me he was seeing the same thing as me as he quickly blurted out, "Dude, what is that?" We quickly shot our eyes back in front of us, and before we could even prepare for her, she was gone. Completely vanished, as if there wasn't an all-white glowing woman walking no further than 20 feet ahead of us. We began speed walking in silence. Neither of us wanted to seem scared at first. So much was running through my mind, just trying to comprehend what was happening. Eventually I spoke up. All I said was, "Let's go." And we both started running as fast as we could without one of us getting ahead of the other. I lost track of how far in we were at that point, but it was definitely more than a half-mile in. But as fast as we ran, it seemed we were at the end of the trail within seconds. This whole ordeal was probably around only a minute long, but from the sheer horror, it felt like time came to a standstill. We quickly got into my car parked near the trail entrance, and I hightailed it back to his house. Nick began saying, "Bro, what just happened? We both saw that, right?" And we began confirming with each other everything we just witnessed. We asked, what did we see? Why did we see her? Why did she show herself to us? What does this mean? My understanding of reality was completely altered. It felt like such a dystopian reality when it occurred, like we stumbled into a limbo of some sort. To this day, I have no idea what else it could have been. It was so real, and the area became so unnatural when this happened. What creeps me out the most, and comforts my sanity, is that we both saw it. We both saw a woman in a dress glowing white walking towards us with an unfazed, uninterrupted stride, like it wasn't actually walking on the ground. We didn't hear footsteps or anything. I suggested that due to there being a lot of old folks who live in that area, that it was the spirit of someone who once lived there and possibly enjoyed the trail in their youth. I have also heard that the area was a popular grounds during the Civil War. Nick and I reminisce occasionally about our experience, and have even attempted going back with the intentions of seeing her again. However, when we did, I was overwhelmed with a gut feeling to turn back around before we saw something we really didn't want to see again. Since then, I've been more open to the idea of spirits, and still can't really wrap my head around what we saw. We tell this story to our friends and loved ones, but when we do, it doesn't have the same surrealness to it. They usually laugh it off as yet another wild story, rather than a truly reality-warping experience. I made this account to post this because my friend thought it was a total glitch when I told him. I don't know what to think though, and never believed in these kinds of things. But here it goes. Some days ago in the morning, I went to the market to get stuff for lunch. I went alone because of all this COVID stuff. Before going, my mom gave me money and my sister helped me write down the list. We talked a bit, I took the car and left. When I came back, about 45 minutes after leaving, my mom and sister started looking at me, analyzing me almost. After an awkward moment, we start talking, but they were calling me a wrong name. They kept calling me Lucas. My name is Daniel. So maybe they were pulling a prank, I thought. But my mom is a total snob. I have never seen her pull a prank or laugh at something like this. Whatever. I just probably misheard them and interpreted it all wrong. I asked them to clean what I had brought and rush upstairs to my room. I take my computer and do some homework I had left. Then I play some video games. When I go back down, they call me Lucas again. Okay, I hadn't misheard them. They are calling me Lucas. Who the hell is Lucas? I asked them. My mom says, "That's your name, honey." "No, my name is Daniel," I say. Silence. "Oh, of course your name is Daniel," says my mom and sister, but they still weren't really sure. Longer silence. I make lunch. We eat together. No one mentions Lucas. No one mentions what happened before, but the air is really tense and I can barely eat. They gradually go throughout the day, start treating me like normal again. I still feel weirded out as to what happened that day. I don't have an answer. It was unsettling. Still feels like that. No one we know is named Lucas. What were they thinking? A little update. We just finished having lunch, and I tried to challenge them, asking personal questions as some of you suggested. I made inside jokes, and they got them. I asked them to put my favorite TV show on, and they asked which between my two favorites I wanted. We also talked about a trip we made when I was young. They knew everything. Then I asked them about the incident. They stare at me for a few seconds and change the subject. I ask again. Same thing happens. They do not want to talk about it. I am more afraid than before. What's going on? My girlfriend and I tried the app for the first time 2 hours ago in the dark with the intent of experiencing something crazy. We knew about Randonautica through paranormal YouTube videos, so we wanted to have a terrifying experience. The first 2 locations were kinda unfitting because of private properties, but on the third try we used the option Void, and as intent, I tried to focus on feeling absolutely terrified. We were driving in the car to the coordinates and it led us through high fields on a really rural road. When we got closer, we saw another car already at the spot where we wanted to stop so we could walk the rest of the way. As we drove closer, it drove away like it noticed us, and we waited until we couldn't see it anymore. There's no way someone just drives there by accident, considering the state of the road. We then parked the car right at the huge windmill that was basically marking the way to the location for us. After being too scared to go out of the car for like 10 minutes, we finally managed to have the courage and we got out and started walking. That's when my girlfriend started recording everything just in case something happens. If I had to guess, the spot was a foot walk of around 30 meters, and as we were halfway there we heard loud noises from the direction of the windmill where I had parked the car. It sounded like someone loudly ran up or down the metal stairway at its entrance. That's when we started to become nervous, but we figured this was probably just the machinery inside making the noises. But then they happened a couple more times, and considering our car was right next to these sounds, I was worried someone might be there, especially because of the car. But then they happened a couple more times, and considering our car was right next to these sounds, I was worried someone might be there, especially because of the car we saw right before us. We then decided to head back to the car, but while we were walking, we started hearing more sounds like someone was following us in the bushes, and we occasionally saw something coming towards us from the direction of the windmill, but we kept walking. Right as we got closer to the car, we heard a loud sound again, so we just started running and drove away immediately. Like I said, we recorded everything and the sounds from the windmill are really clear on the recording, so if there's some interest I can post it here. We definitely plan on doing more scary exploring. Please help. Weird sightings in St. Paul, Minneapolis. I don't know where else to post this. I believe in the paranormal and have had experiences myself. I'm posting this story from my girlfriend who doesn't have a Reddit account. Around half an hour ago at exactly 3:02 a.m., my girlfriend called me 2 blocks from her house, absolutely terrified. Her voice was shaking like I've never heard before. As she was driving towards her house, she saw a large white semi-humanoid figure crawling on all fours, about 6 to 7 feet tall. It was stark white under a street lamp and its limbs were extremely skinny. She was so scared she couldn't get herself to leave the car to go into her house when she parked. I looked into local legends and old tales of just any creature I could find in the region. Sent her a screenshot of an image and the description I had found, and she said it fit to a T. Do you guys think this is possible? Have you seen anything like this? She isn't one for stories and would never lie to me, and both she and I are worried about what could happen to her after seeing such a weird thing. I'll start by saying I'm not proud of this, but I'm still alive and I would like answers. Tonight, I got off work and was extremely depressed. I've had issues with mental health my entire life. I got home to my ex-fiancée and remembered that the breakup was still fresh, and she had just told me that there was no way we'd be getting back together for the foreseeable future. I agreed, but I didn't really like the idea. After many family and friends' deaths this year, and so much pain that I don't care to describe, I decided tonight was the night. I sat and watched my ex sleep for a while, just to take in the peaceful nature of it. Then my daughter woke up and started crying, so I rocked her and said my goodbyes. Like I said, I'm not proud of it, but a suicidal mind works differently. I kissed her head, put her down, and walked away to get my gun. I loaded it and held it for a second. I remember specifically running my nail through the seams in the grip for a few seconds, and then I quickly put it to my head and squeezed the trigger. Then nothing. I opened my eyes after what felt like forever, and I was fine. The gun wasn't even in my hand anymore. I ran outside and laid in the rain after that, wondering if there was a God who spared me for some reason. And now I'm sitting here, just confused. I don't take meds. I was completely sober and conscious, just very, very depressed. I probably won't try it again after that experience. Maybe I've got some sort of question to answer now, or a purpose, I guess. Has anyone else had this happen? What was this? My wife and I hiked and camped quite a bit before we had our first kid. Some backpacking, but mostly car camping that requires a good drive down a forest road. In 2016, we decided after 3 nights in a national forest and adjacent national park, we'd stay at an FS campsite, a change from dispersed camping, a ways from any town, but still a campsite with a bathroom. We had a wonderful time during the day, swam in a lake, yada yada, awesome place. The campsite was mostly busy with small families. One noteworthy group, Loudish people, though well out of sight on the other side of a stand of trees. They brought many cars of all types, at least those that could drive down the road, non-paved, for a good 2 miles. Not bad though, but whatever, let people have fun. I didn't care about the noise. Come night, we go to bed early. No fire as we wake up early to hike before the sun beats down. The group is still loud. My wife does the earplugs. I'm able to ignore it and sleep, no problem. Come 1 a.m., I wake up, perhaps due to the group noise, I don't know. I can hear fewer of them, maybe 4 or 5 people that were audible, enough to make out every 4th or 5th word. Loud drunkenness, but it was initially friendly, cursing, laughing. Next thing, I hear a guy call a lady a vagina, but not so nicely. And shit goes downhill from there. Now they are yelling expletives that I can mostly make out because of the yelling. Women and men both telling each other to fuck off. Luckily my wife is still out sleeping. Out of this mess of people yelling, a woman just starts screaming, shrieking. Something changed and happened to her. This wasn't just someone joining the verbal fight. This was the first time my heart rate went up. What the hell is happening? Even while others in the group are still yelling, I can tell the shrieking girl is moving away from the group, but is still yelling, loud. Like distorting your voice yelling. Her yells turn into words, help, as she moves. And hell, I can begin to tell she is getting closer to the tent site area where I am. Screaming girl is getting closer, but it's hard to tell. Then her screams for help become clear, where I'm able to make out, help, someone's trying to stab me. I can hear her move from the road to the parking area where my car is parked, coming closer to the trailhead that connects to my campsite. In my head, I'm like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, don't come to the trail, don't come to the trail. My tent is the first one once you enter the trail. My wife is sleeping through the yelling still. I might sound like an asshole for not jumping up and playing the hero here, but screw that. I'm not touching drunk people drama. Sure enough, she starts down the trail. The trail splits, and I'm on the right. I'm thinking, go left, go left. My wife is starting to wake up, pulls out the earplugs. I turn to her. It's okay, it's okay. Nope. Yelling girl turns right, walks right up to our tent, stands next to it. Help me, can you please help me? She's sobbing. I get up first and open the tent. In the twilight and the light from the girl's phone, I can see that she's a teenager. Drunk as hell. Not bleeding or stabbed, luckily. I'm tired and don't respond well, sputtering a bit. Saying things like, I don't know, we can't. My wife pops up and handles the situation like a boss. Calming her down, asking her name, sitting her down on the picnic table, de-escalating. The short version of the girl's story is, she's 16. Her cousin got jealous about hugging her boyfriend, threatened and maybe tried to stab the 16-year-old. All were drinking. Meanwhile, we can hear people over in the campsite continuing to rage, yelling at each other. It's now mostly just two guys yelling at each other. My wife instructs the girl to drink water and stay away from her cousin. They were going over options. I'm trying to use either of our phones, wife's and mine, to call the police. No signal. Luckily, other campers have woken up and come to our area. They have a signal and call the police. The girl has calmed down at this point and wants to leave. We are all wary as we can still hear the dudes screaming at each other. The girl abruptly leaves. Wife and I, plus two other campers, are standing in the parking area near the trail, just wondering what it's all about. The dudes yelling in the background escalate to a fist fight. You can hear skin slaps like someone got popped, falling into shrubs, shouting. The four of us sitting there waiting for the police. This goes on for a while. 30 minutes and no police. Understandable given the location. Suddenly, the 16-year-old girl comes back. She has half a fifth of vodka in her hand. Now she is cursing. I'm gonna mess her up. I have guns. My mom has a gun at her house. My wife and the two campers whip out their negotiation skills and talk her down. Wife gets 16-year-old to give up the bottle and sit on the ground. Do you think messing her up is a good decision right now? I'm looking at my wife like, is that gonna work? Girl is like, no. I'm such a loser with my capabilities right now. I play no useful role in all of this. The teenager then reveals that her mom is on the tribal council. She said everyone in the group is going to be in trouble over this. I didn't realize, but apparently that is important shit to people in that area. Guys in background are still yelling. A second fistfight ensues. Police finally get there. In short, police get the story told to them. I see eyebrows go up when the girl mentions who her mom is. They seemingly reluctantly pack the teenager into the car, and as soon as they move her into the car, she screams violently. Doors close and you can still hear that screaming. The fighting dudes in the group must have seen the lights and the commotion stopped. Police talk to them. Cops leave with the girl. Then it's quiet, close to 3 a.m. Shaken, the wife and I go back to our tent and discuss the next steps. Should we stay? We decided we were leaving first thing in the morning, but while lying there trying to sleep, the group again begins to shout at each other. Expletives more along the lines of, we're screwed, and screw you. Nope, we're out. So in the dark, we quietly pack the car. For some reason, the wife and I were concerned that the group would hear us. The tent goes in, unfolded, and fast. Once everything is in, when we start the car, suddenly one of the dudes from the fighting group sprints over to our parking lot like he's about to try and stop us. First time seeing him, shirtless skinny guy in shorts. I accelerate quickly towards him. He's in the middle of the lot, then turn toward the road and get out of there. Nearly 3 hours of driving back to the city. This story is an encounter my grandmother had back in early 2001. My grandma and grandpa just moved into a very isolated cabin in the North Georgia mountains to escape the fast-paced city life after they retired. The house was perched on the side of a mountain on about 5 acres of their property, with a very long gravel driveway from the so-called main road which connected the surrounding cabins. The closest house was about 1 or 2 miles away as the crow flies, and 3 to 4 miles by road. So yeah, definitely a low-key spot that's very hard to find. Soon after they purchased the property, they began the moving process, and both grandparents ended up making separate runs from their old house to the new house. One night, my grandmother was alone at the new house in the mountains, while my grandpa was back at the old house taking care of some final business and last-minute packing. He decided to stay there for the night and avoid the 2-hour drive back to the new house, in turn leaving my grandmother alone in the middle of nowhere. She was fine with it and decided to go ahead and sleep to prepare for more moving the next day. At around 1 a.m., the house was dead silent, and all of a sudden there was a very loud knock at the front door. Now keep in mind, you could easily hear someone if they drove up the driveway, but she never heard a car. The front door was all glass, so it basically sounded like someone was banging on a window. She was terrified, to say the least, and decided to stay in bed and wait it out. The knocks came again, this time even louder. At this point, her adrenaline and fear is through the roof, not knowing who could possibly be at the door this late at night, in the middle of nowhere. Once again, she stays in bed and waits it out. About 5 minutes pass, and there are no more knocks. She waits even longer to maybe hear a car drive away or something, but no car ever drove off. The only way someone could have been there is if they walked several miles through the woods to get there, or walked up the very long driveway. Nothing else ever happened that night, and nothing ever came of it. Still, a pretty strange and creepy occurrence for such an isolated place. So my mom and I decided to try the app tonight at 1 a.m. and asked it to take us somewhere haunted. We're paranormal freaks. It took us to some field on the edge of a highway that had a gate in front of it. We walked up to it just to see what we could see, and a guy started walking out from a nearby house. Thinking, oh shit, we're about to get yelled at for trying to trespass, we head back to where the car is parked to let him know we're not a threat, when he asks us if we saw the lights in the field. We were confused, but intrigued, and asked him to elaborate. He said that he's seen lights in that field that he can't explain, so much so that he set up a trail cam to try and catch more. He said stuff moves in his house, and he thought people were messing with him. He even said every time he's working outside, it sounds like someone is calling his name from the field. So essentially, it's haunted as fuck. Gotta say, the app succeeded, and now my mom is hooked.